He never saw it coming. 1 second, he was preaching. The next, his own mother pulled out a gun and shot him. Right there. On the pulpit. In front of everyone. The congregation screamed. Some dropped to their knees in shock. Others ran, trampling over pews in a blind panic. But for Pastor David Carter, there was no time to react. One bullet. Then another. His wife Angela, standing beside him, fell next. Blood soaked the church floor. The same floor where they had baptized children, where they had prayed for the sick, where they had preached about forgiveness, love, and redemption. And now, it had become a crime scene. All because of a secret. A secret so dark, so twisted, so unthinkable, it shattered their entire world in an instant. You see, Pastor David had just exposed something his family had spent decades burying. His own mother had been sleeping with his wife's father. And the worst part? David and Angela might be brother and sister. Let that sink in for a second. A mother, so desperate to keep the truth from coming out, murdered her own son. Her son, who had dedicated his entire life to God. A man of faith. A husband. A father. Gone. Because he spoke the truth. What kind of secret could drive a mother to murder? What kind of pain does it take to make a man stand before an entire church, and expose his own bloodline's darkest betrayal? And here's the question that will haunt you long after this story is over. If you were in his shoes, would you have exposed the truth? Before we dive into this jaw-dropping true crime case, let's step back for a moment. Before the blood. Before the gunshots. Before an entire congregation watched a family unravel in the most horrifying way possible. Let's go back, to the beginning. To a time when everything seemed perfect. When the Carter family was admired, respected, even envied. Because no one, could have ever imagined the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. For the people of Silverwood, Texas, Pastor David Carter was more than just a preacher. He was their rock. A man of unwavering faith. A man whose sermons didn't just fill the church pews, they filled hearts. David wasn't the kind of pastor who just read scripture from a pulpit. No, he lived it. He was the man who showed up at hospital bedsides to pray for the sick. The man who counseled troubled marriages late into the night. The man who knew everyone's name, everyone's pain, everyone's story. To the outside world, he had it all. A thriving ministry. A beautiful wife. 3 wonderful children. A mother who had raised him with strong Christian values. But most of all, he had the truth. And in the end, it was the truth that got him killed. Also, Angela Carter was the kind of woman people gravitated toward. Soft-spoken but warm, kind but strong. A woman who had spent her life as a pastor's wife, a mother, and a pillar of her community. She stood by David's side, Sunday after Sunday, leading women's ministry, counseling young couples, organizing charity drives. She was the perfect example of a Proverbs 31 woman, the kind of wife the Bible spoke of, the kind of wife every man in the congregation wanted. And she loved her husband. Deeply. Truly. At least, that's what she believed. Until she found out the one thing that could destroy everything they had ever built. Because for Angela, discovering the truth about her father wasn't just painful, it was earth-shattering. It wasn't just an affair. It was something so much worse. And meet Evelyn Carter. Evelyn Carter had spent decades crafting the perfect image. A woman of grace. Dignity. A mother who had raised a pastor. A woman of deep faith, who never missed a Sunday service, who led Bible studies, who spoke of morals, of righteousness, of family values. But the truth was, Evelyn Carter was not the woman she pretended to be. She carried a secret. One so dark, so heavy, that if it ever came to light, it would destroy everything. And she had kept that secret buried for years. Buried so deep, even she had convinced herself it didn't exist. Until David found out. Until he stood in front of their church and exposed her, in front of everyone. And in that moment, with her entire world collapsing around her, she made a choice. She chose silence. Not through words. Through bullets. And here is James Mitchell. He was a name that carried power in Silverwood. Wealthy. Influential. Respected. The kind of man who owned half the businesses in town. The kind of man who had politicians in his pocket. The kind of man people spoke about in hushed whispers, because in a place like Silverwood, you didn't cross James Mitchell. He was Angela's father. A businessman. A family man. A man who had built an empire from the ground up. But underneath the wealth, the power, the reputation, James Mitchell was a liar. A man who had spent years cheating, deceiving, manipulating. And the worst part? He got away with it. Because when the truth came out, when blood was spilled, when David Carter lay dying on the church floor, James Mitchell wasn't the one in handcuffs. James Mitchell walked away. Untouched. They were the perfect family. A pastor. A wife. A mother. A father-in-law. Pillars of their church. Pillars of their town. Pillars of deception. Because behind the prayers, behind the perfect Sunday smiles, behind the carefully constructed facade of faith, a nightmare was waiting. And when the truth finally came out, it left destruction in its wake. Now, let's go back to the moment everything began to unravel. To the first crack in the perfect foundation. Because before there was murder. Before there was bloodshed. Before a mother stood over her own son's body, holding the smoking gun in her trembling hands, there was a secret. A secret that should have never come to light. For years, David Carter had believed his life was built on solid ground. His faith. His family. His marriage. But faith can be tested. Families can hide secrets. And marriages, well, sometimes, they aren't built on love. Sometimes, they're built on lies. David never expected to uncover something that would turn his entire world inside out. It started as a feeling. Nothing obvious. Nothing alarming. Just small, fleeting moments. Odd coincidences. A strange hesitation in his mother's voice when she mentioned Angela's father. A look, so quick, so subtle, exchanged between Evelyn and James Mitchell during a Sunday dinner. And then, there were the phone calls. Late at night. Whispers behind closed doors. Voices that went silent the moment he entered the room. He wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him. It was a Wednesday evening. David had just finished counseling a couple at the church and was heading home when he realized his mother's car wasn't in the driveway. Nothing unusual. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Until he saw her. Sitting in a car. Not hers. James Mitchell's. Parked on the edge of town, near an old gas station. Their faces were too close. Their conversation too intense. And then, he saw something that made his stomach drop. His mother reached out and touched James's hand, the kind of touch that wasn't casual. The kind of touch that held history. The kind of touch a married woman should never have for a man that wasn't her husband. David froze. A sick, twisting feeling gripped his chest. No. No, this was ridiculous. His mother and Angela's father. Impossible. Unthinkable. But the doubt had already been planted. And now, it was growing. That night, David sat across from Evelyn at the dinner table. The air between them was heavy. He pushed his plate aside, folded his hands, looked her straight in the eye. "Where were you today?" A simple question. A casual question. But Evelyn Carter was a woman who never stumbled over her words. She had a quick answer for everything. Always polished. Always perfect. But tonight? Tonight, there was a pause. Too long. Too unnatural. Then, she laughed. A forced, brittle sound. "Oh, just running errands." David didn't blink. "With James Mitchell?" The smile on Evelyn's face didn't fade, but it froze. And in that split second, that one moment of hesitation, David saw something in his mother's eyes that sent a chill down his spine. Not just shock. Not just fear. Something else. Something darker. Something that told him, clear as day. She was lying. David didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. And the more he thought about it, the more he saw it. The weird way James Mitchell always lingered around Evelyn. The hushed conversations that stopped the second he walked into the room. The odd way Angela's birth certificate had never been displayed in their home like her siblings. And suddenly, things that had never made sense before, clicked. What if? No. No, it was too insane. But that's the thing about the truth. It doesn't care if it sounds crazy. It doesn't care if it ruins lives. It just waits. Until someone is brave enough to see it. Days passed. David tried to push the thought away. But it followed him. It was everywhere. In his sermons. In his prayers. In the way his mother's voice wavered whenever James Mitchell's name was mentioned. And then, it happened. A week later, David stopped by his mother's house unannounced. The door was slightly open. He stepped inside, calling her name. No answer. And then, he heard it. Two voices. One his mother's. The other, James Mitchell's. And the words they spoke, they shattered everything. "This can never come out, James." Evelyn's voice was sharp, urgent. "He's already suspicious, Ev." James sounded tense. "Then we have to make sure he never finds out the truth." David felt the breath leave his body. The truth. There it was. Clear as day. Undeniable. He had been right. His mother and Angela's father had been hiding something for years. And now, David had proof. One conversation. One slip-up. And suddenly, David Carter knew something that could destroy everything. But what he didn't know was that this truth would cost him his life. David Carter sat in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the wall. His hands trembled as he spread out the pieces of a puzzle he never wanted to solve. Old letters, yellowed with time. Bank statements, showing money transfers that made no sense. Photographs. Photographs that should have never existed. And in that moment, staring at the undeniable evidence in front of him, he realized, he was living inside a nightmare. A nightmare that had started long before he was even born. Because the truth wasn't just a betrayal. It wasn't just an affair. It was something far, far worse. His mother, Evelyn Carter, a woman of faith, a woman who raised him, a woman he trusted more than anyone, had been sleeping with Angela's father, James Mitchell, for over 30 years. 3 decades. A hidden relationship spanning his entire life. And the worst part? This wasn't some brief, shameful fling. This was love. Secret, forbidden, twisted love. A love that outlasted their own marriages. A love that outlasted their own morality. A love that created something monstrous. Because as David dug deeper, pulling out birth certificates, medical records, timelines, he found the detail that made his stomach turn. Something so horrific it made him feel like he couldn't breathe. Angela. His wife. The mother of his children. The woman he had slept beside every night for the past decade. Might be his half-sister. David's breath was shallow. His vision blurred. The room around him felt like it was closing in. His wedding day. Their vows, their first child, every single moment they had ever shared, was tainted. Unholy. A sin. Angela. His wife. His own blood. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear the walls down. He wanted to believe this wasn't real. But the evidence was staring right back at him. His mother's handwriting in love letters to James, spanning years. Hotel receipts. Secret bank withdrawals. Angela's birth certificate. The missing paternity test that was never done. It had been right there, in front of him, all along. And now, there was no escaping it. David sat across from Angela, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't know how to say it. How do you tell the woman you love, the woman you share a bed with, the woman who has given birth to your children, that she might be your own flesh and blood? But the words came. Broken. Shattered. Unbelievable. And Angela, she collapsed. Not physically. But inside, where it mattered. Her face twisted, her breath hitched, her fingers dug into her own arms as if trying to hold herself together. No. She shook her head. No. No, this isn't possible. But David showed her the proof. And in that moment, Angela Carter was no longer a wife. She was no longer a mother. She was something else. Something worse. A victim of the greatest deception of her life. She covered her mouth as a broken sob escaped her lips. Because if this was true, if her father had secretly been with David's mother for years, then everything had been a lie. David confronted her. Evelyn Carter. The woman who had raised him. The woman who had taught him to be honest, to be faithful, to fear God. And she broke. For the first time in his life, David saw his mother, truly saw her. Not as the woman of faith she pretended to be. Not as the devoted mother everyone believed she was. But as a fraud. A woman who had built an entire life on deception. Tears streamed down her face as she begged. David, please. Please, my son, you don't understand. Her hands trembled as she reached for him. This will ruin us. It will ruin you. It will ruin everything. But David? David was done living in the dark. I will not be silent. His voice was steady. Cold. Final. Evelyn's face twisted into something ugly. Not sorrow. Not regret. But fear. Because she knew. She knew what was coming. She knew what had to be done. Because David Carter had made his choice. He was going to tell the truth. And for Evelyn Carter, that meant only one thing. David Carter had to die. It was Sunday. A day of peace. A day of worship. A day when families came together, hands clasped in prayer, hearts lifted toward the heavens. But this Sunday would end in bloodshed. The congregation at Silverwood Baptist Church was larger than usual. Word had spread that Pastor David Carter had something important to say. People filled the pews, shifting with uneasy anticipation. Some thought it was a special announcement. Others whispered that it might be something bigger. But no one, not a single person, could have imagined what was about to happen. David Carter stood at the pulpit, looking out at the faces of people who had trusted him for years. His hands were steady. But inside, He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into the unknown. He took a deep breath. And then he began. David's voice was calm, steady, deliberate. There are moments in life when the truth is too heavy to carry alone. Moments when silence is no longer an option. Today is one of those moments. The church was silent. Even the children, usually restless, seemed frozen in place. He continued. For years, I have dedicated my life to this church. To faith. To my family. But I have recently discovered something that has shaken the very foundation of everything I believed in. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People glanced at one another. David's eyes locked onto his mother, Evelyn, sitting near the middle pews. She was still. Her face expressionless. But her hands were gripping the edge of the bench so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. My mother, David said, his voice never wavering, has been having an affair with my wife's father, James Mitchell, for over 30 years. Gasps. Sharp. Audible. A woman covered her mouth. A man's head snapped toward James Mitchell, who sat frozen, his face drained of color. Angela, sitting near the front, flinched as if she'd been struck. David continued. And because of that affair, there is reason to believe that my wife, Angela, and I, may be half-siblings. A stunned silence fell over the church. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. A low murmur of confusion, of disbelief, swept through the pews. Someone whispered, "No, this can't be real." David swallowed hard. His eyes burned, but he had no more tears left to shed. He had said it. The truth was out. And then, from the middle pews, Evelyn Carter stood. Evelyn's face was pale. Her hands trembled. Her lips, pressed into a thin, bloodless line, parted slightly, as if she were about to say something. But she didn't. Instead, she reached into her purse. David saw the movement. A flicker of something wrong. A split second of realization. And then, she pulled out a gun. Screams. Gasps. Someone yelled, "No." A woman clutched her chest. A baby began crying. The entire church erupted into chaos. But David didn't move. He stood there, frozen, staring at the woman who had given him life, who was now about to take it away. Their eyes locked. And in that single moment, he saw it. Not rage. Not hatred. But desperation. A mother who had spent her entire life hiding a lie. And now, that lie had been exposed for the world to see. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. Bang! The first shot rang out. David staggered back. A red stain bloomed across his chest. The congregation screamed. Some dove under the pews. Others ran toward the exits, shoving past one another in a blind panic. Angela shrieked. "David!" She lunged forward. Bang! The second shot. Angela collapsed beside her husband, her hand outstretched, fingers inches from his. Blood pooled beneath them, soaking into the sacred carpet, into the place where they had stood together for years. Prayed together. Preached together. Lived together. And now, they lay dying together. Evelyn stood over them, gun still raised, her breathing ragged. Her eyes darted across the panicked congregation, her face void of emotion. James Mitchell was still in his seat, motionless. Staring. The weight of his sins written across his face. A man who had caused all of this, and yet, he remained untouched. Someone yelled, "Call 911." People rushed toward the fallen couple. Someone tried to apply pressure to David's wound, another to Angela's. The church was in shambles. And Evelyn Carter? She didn't run. She didn't fight. She simply stood there, gun in hand, staring at her son's body, at the life she had just taken. Because while David Carter died for the truth, James Mitchell lived to hide another lie. The church was never supposed to be a crime scene. It was a place of worship. A place where people sought comfort, peace, and forgiveness. But on that Sunday morning, there was no peace. There was no forgiveness. There was only chaos, blood, and the horrifying, unshakable reality that a mother had just murdered her own son. Screams echoed off the stained glass windows. People ran, some scrambling over pews, others frozen in place, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Some were crying. Others were praying. And on the ground, in the center of it all, David Carter lay still. His chest rose once. Then never again. Beside him, Angela gasped for air. Blood soaked through her dress, her fingers trembling as she tried to reach for him, tried to hold on to the man she had loved, the man she might have been related to. But he was gone. David Carter, the man who had spent his life preaching about truth, was dead. And the woman who killed him? She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just stood there, motionless, gun in hand, staring at her son's body like she had just put down a sick dog. And then, the sirens. A wall of blue and red lights flooded the church parking lot. The police stormed in, weapons drawn, yelling orders. Drop the weapon. Evelyn Carter turned her head, her face blank. For the first time in her life, she had nothing left to hide. She lowered the gun, raised her hands, and let the officers drag her away in handcuffs. As she was led out the doors of the church, her face remained eerily calm. No tears. No resistance. Just silence. Because in her mind, the moment David opened his mouth that morning, he was already dead. She had simply finished what needed to be done. Paramedics rushed to Angela's side. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, blood pooling around her, her breaths shallow and uneven. Someone pressed cloth against her wound, begging her to hold on. But Angela? She wasn't sure she wanted to. She had just watched the love of her life die. She had just learned that her entire marriage was a lie. She had just lost everything. As they loaded her into the ambulance, she whispered something. The paramedic leaned in closer. Is it true? Angela's voice was barely there. Fragile. Shattered. Am I his sister? The paramedic didn't answer. Because in that moment, the only thing that mattered was keeping her alive. The news spread like wildfire. By the time the last church member had been escorted outside, the entire town of Silverwood, Texas had heard the story. A mother. A pastor. A murder. And the secret that had led to all of it. The congregation was in ruins. Churchgoers wept on the steps of the church. Some refused to leave, unable to comprehend that the place they had considered holy had become the setting of a cold-blooded murder. How could she do this? Someone sobbed. She loved him. He was her son. But love had nothing to do with it. This wasn't about love. This was about control. Evelyn Carter had spent 3 decades covering up the truth. And when that truth came screaming out of her son's mouth in front of an entire congregation, she silenced him. And then there was James Mitchell. The man at the center of it all. The man who had spent years sneaking around with another man's wife. The man who had never once admitted what he had done. And when the gunshots rang out, he stayed in his seat. Did nothing. Said nothing. He watched his daughter collapse. He watched his illegitimate son bleed out. And still, he said nothing. As reporters swarmed the church, as the police dragged Evelyn away, as Angela was rushed to the hospital, as the world fell apart around him, James Mitchell just sat there. Like a man who knew that, somehow, some way, he would get away with it. By nightfall, the town was split. Some said Evelyn Carter was a monster. A mother who had betrayed her own flesh and blood. A woman who cared more about saving face than saving her son's life. Others weren't so sure. She was desperate, one church member said in an interview. Maybe she just snapped. But snapping implies a moment of weakness. This was a choice. Evelyn Carter had walked into that church with a gun in her purse. She had listened to every word her son said. She had waited. And when the moment came, when the truth had been exposed for all to see, she ended it. She silenced her own son. Right there. In front of God and everyone. Angela Carter woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed. Stitches. Tubes. Machines keeping her alive. But inside? She was already dead. She had lost everything. Her husband. Her marriage. Her entire identity. Because even though she was alive, she would never escape the truth. The man she had loved, the father of her children, might have been her own blood. And now? She would never get answers. Because David was dead. Her father wouldn't talk. And her mother-in-law was sitting in a jail cell, refusing to say a single word. Angela Carter was alive. But she was trapped in a nightmare she would never wake up from. In the days following the shooting, Silverwood, Texas, became the center of a media storm. The headlines were everywhere: mother kills pastor son in front of congregation. Dark family secrets lead to murder in Texas church. Did Evelyn Carter kill to protect the truth? But for the detectives assigned to the case, this wasn't just another tragic murder. This was a web of secrets, betrayal, and blood. And the deeper they dug, the darker it got. Detectives started where all secrets leave their fingerprints: paperwork. And what they found was damning. Old love letters between Evelyn Carter and James Mitchell, dating back more than 30 years. Hotel receipts from secret meetups in nearby towns, always paid in cash. Bank statements showing thousands of dollars funneled between accounts, Evelyn to James, James to Evelyn. A missing paternity test from when Angela was born, one that was never conducted. But the most shocking discovery? A single, handwritten letter, never sent, written by Evelyn to James, dated 2 years before David's death. In it, she wrote, "One day, David will put the pieces together. And if that happens, James, we both know what we have to do." It wasn't just an affair. It was a plan. A plan to protect their secret, no matter the cost. And David? David was the sacrificial lamb. Inside a cold, dimly lit interrogation room, Evelyn Carter sat with her hands folded. No tears. No regret. No fear. Detectives pushed. Pressed. "Why did you kill your son?" She stared at them, her voice even. "Because he wouldn't stay silent." "Did you plan it?" A pause. Then, she tilted her head, almost bored. "Some things don't need to be planned. Some things are just necessary." One detective leaned forward. Was James Mitchell involved? For the first time. Evelyn smiled. James Mitchell has never been involved in anything. That's his greatest talent. It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt they would ever get. But in the end, Evelyn Carter wasn't protecting James. She was protecting herself. Because if she went down, she was going down alone. 6 months later, the trial began. The courtroom was packed. Reporters. News cameras. Strangers who had never met David Carter but wanted to see the mother who shot her own son. And in the front row, Angela. Still weak. Still broken. But she was there. Because David couldn't speak for himself. So she would speak for him. When Evelyn took the stand, she didn't cry. She didn't beg for mercy. Instead, she did what she had always done. She controlled the narrative. I did what any mother would do, she said, voice steady. I protected my family. The courtroom gasped. David's former congregation members shook their heads in disbelief. She continued. My son was determined to destroy us. He didn't care about the consequences. He didn't care who he hurt. He was obsessed with tearing this family apart. The prosecutor cut in, voice sharp. Pastor David Carter wasn't destroying his family. He was telling the truth. For the first time, Evelyn's composure cracked. Her lips pressed together. But she said nothing. Because the truth had already spoken for itself. When Angela Carter took the stand, the room fell silent. She looked fragile. Pale. Like a woman who had spent 6 months trying to wake up from a nightmare that never ended. Her voice trembled at first. But when she spoke, she did not hold back. David loved his mother. Her voice cracked. More than anything. More than himself. And she killed him for it. Evelyn didn't blink. Angela turned to the jury. My husband stood on that pulpit and told the truth. And for that, his own mother pulled the trigger. She swallowed, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. I lost my husband. My children lost their father. And for what? Her eyes locked onto Evelyn's. Because you were afraid of a secret. Because you were afraid of shame. She exhaled shakily. No mother should ever do what you did. No mother should ever kill her son. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge looked shaken. And for the first time, Evelyn Carter looked away. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours. And when they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty. Life in prison without parole. A mother who had betrayed her son. A mother who had sealed her own fate. But as Evelyn was led away, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply lifted her chin, and walked out of the courtroom. Because Evelyn Carter was never sorry. She was just caught. And what about James Mitchell? The man who started it all. The man who sat silent while 2 families burned. He was never charged. Never held accountable. Never spent a single day in prison. And the worst part? He never spoke David's name again. He left town. Vanished. Like a man who knew that in the end. The ones who keep silent are the ones who always survive. Angela never returned to Silverwood. She left behind the church. The past. Her name. Because there was nothing left for her there. Only a grave. A single, cold headstone in the town cemetery. David Carter, a man who died for the truth, in the final, painful words that echoed in her mind as she walked away. If I had never fallen in love with him, he might still be alive. Some stories leave you shaken. Others leave you haunted. But then, there are those that stay with you forever, because they force you to question everything you thought you knew. This is one of those stories. A mother, Evelyn Carter, sat in church every Sunday, preaching about love, faith, and family values. But when the truth threatened to come out, she destroyed her own family. A son, Pastor David Carter, risked everything for honesty. But honesty got him killed. A wife, Angela Carter, discovered that the man she built her life with might have been her own blood. And she will never be whole again. And James Mitchell? The one man at the center of it all. He walked away. No guilt. No punishment. Just silence. Because in the end, the ones who stay silent are the ones who survive. David Carter believed the truth would set him free. Instead, it put him in a grave. So, we have to ask ourselves, was the truth really the villain? Or was it the lies that festered for decades, growing like poison, feeding on secrecy, building up to something that could only end in blood? And here's the question that will haunt you long after this video ends: if you were David, would you have exposed the truth, knowing the risks? Would you have stood at that pulpit, in front of an entire congregation, knowing that the people you loved the most would rather see you dead than let their sins be known? Or would you have stayed silent? Would you have swallowed the secret, and lived? I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below. Would you have done what David did? Or would you have walked away from the truth? And if this story shocked you, you haven't seen anything yet. Subscribe